So can I start? Or yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you are enjoy the meeting. And as a convener of our second day afternoon session, I'm happy to announce three amazing lectures, three amazing talks. You will see, you will hear today. And first lecture you will hear now is a lecture of Dr. Matthias Vanmaercke. I hope I pronounced it right. Sorry if I made some mistakes. Matthias is associate professor at the University of Liège, and his research focuses on understanding geomorphic processes at regional, continental, and global scales, and understanding the sensitivity of these processes to climate change and long cover changes. So Matthias, as you already know, we have 1 hour in total, including 45 minutes for lecture and 15 more minutes for answering questions. And yeah, I think you can start. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for joining. It's much appreciated. I'll try sharing my screen again. Just a second. Okay, so thank you and welcome all. In these next 45 minutes, I hope to explain you a bit more about gully erosion, and then mainly why it's important, how it influences sediment fluxes, and what we can and cannot do at this moment, mainly when it comes to predicting this process at larger scales. This presentation has mainly been building on work we've been doing over the past years, as well as some other research. But I like to emphasize that this is certainly not just my work, but also I had a lot of help from other researchers and PhD students. So maybe first of all, let's think about what actually is gully erosion, because it's maybe something that's not familiar to all of you. But basically these gullies I'll be talking about are large incisional channels that typically form on hill slopes, but also sometimes in alluvial plains. And they are generally caused by concentrated runoff or water discharge that starts to incise into the soil once specific thresholds are reached, and they can achieve very large dimensions. And because of their form, shape, and positions, they can have a lot of relevant impacts that are worthwhile studying, predicting, and avoiding where we can. One of these impacts is, for example, reduced crop yields. This is, for example, a photo from northern Ethiopia, where you see a gully flowing through a valley. And of course, you can see two things. Farmers lose arable land because of these gullies, but here you also see that closer to the gully borders, the crops are more wilting. They have less water available, so they are more yellow. And this will, of course, have a significant impact on crop yields because basically the gully drains the soil and leads to a lower water availability. In several cases, gullies can also cause infrastructural damage to roads, often claim casualties, etc. And this can become quite extreme. This is, for example, a picture I took in Kinshasa last year, where just an urban gully has formed very recently, the night before. And basically it is a gully that incised through the road and destroyed several houses. And this is certainly not a unique case. This is, for example, an aerial photo of Kikwit in 2013. This is the same spot 6 years later in 2019. So here you had a gully that further advanced with about 400 meters and really destroyed several dozens of houses. leading to a lot of other impacts as well. Of course, while this is an important geohazard in many cases, it's also an important geomorphic process with significant effects on, for example, catchment sediment loads. First of all, because gullies are an important cause of soil loss. This is, for example, a study from Jean Pouzin in Spain many years ago, where they measured basically the volume of eroded rills and gullies along a transit going from the top of a hill downwards in the valley. What you see is that rill erosion is often quite significant in a volume expressed per hectare and per year, but that the gullies can far exceed this and are often a much more dominant sediment source. Basically, what we see on this graph is the same as on the schedule or on the schema I showed you earlier. A gully may form as small rills, but at a given point, there's a threshold where the runoff volume becomes so large that it really easily incised into the soil and can become much larger, leading to very large soil losses. Furthermore, because gullies are often basically channels, they can have a large influence on the catchment hydrology. For example, leading to higher flood frequencies and magnitudes, but also reduced base flows. For the base flows, I already showed you an example for Ethiopia, where the soil is basically drained because of a gully. This is another study from colleagues in Brazil, where they monitored basically two similar catchments close to each other, one with a gully and one without a gully. If you then just look for the same rainfall events and period to the river discharges, you see that in the preserved catchment without gullies, there are some floods, but in the eroded catchment with gullies, the flood response is, of course, much faster, much more erratic, while the base flow is much lower. Linked to that, gullies can also influence the sediment connectivity. They are in fact additional drainage lines, and as a result, they decrease the distance that needs to be covered from, let's say, a hill slope that may erode until the river channel. So these are, for example, two photos from the same spot in Ethiopia again. In the very far background, you can barely see it. There's a large river channel, the Agula River. Normally, what happens on this hill slope here in front would have no impact on the river below or on the sediment load. But of course, since you have this dendritic river network, you see that during a runoff event, a lot of this water enters into the gully channel and will, because of that, also end up in the stream, affecting sediment loads. We have, for the moment, quite little tools that can actually quantify or correctly incorporate such connectivity effects. But this is, for example, already an attempt by some of my colleagues, where they basically developed an erosion index incorporating for all processes, all the erosion processes themselves, including gully erosion, and plotted these indexes against the observed sediment yields of several catchments in Spain. Basically, you see two populations, one very low and one very high. And basically, those catchments with a much stronger relation are also those with a higher sediment delivery ratio. And what makes this sediment delivery ratio higher? It's mainly the fact that there are gullies. So not that these gullies only cause additional sediment or cause additional erosion and increase the sediment supply. The effect may often be just to increase the connectivity. So these impacts of gully erosion on sediment yields may be very high. And this is also something we observe at continental scales. This is, for example, a compilation of different sediment yield measurement data for different catchment sizes. And what you already see is that sediment yields are, on average, or for even in medium, easily 5 times higher than hill slope erosion rates that do not account for gully erosion, so just sheet and rill erosion. If you then look to the spatial patterns of, for example, sediment yields in Europe, you see that there are several important hotspots where sediment yields are very high, but where if you compare it with a map of sheet and rill erosion on the left, there's not necessarily a lot of sheet and rill erosion going there on there. So the main cause for these high values are most likely gully erosion. The same is true, for example, in Africa. Also here we compiled all the data we could find on observed sediment yields, and we can identify several hotspots. Each of these hotspots is mainly characterized by a lot of gully erosion. So despite decades, in fact, of research, our ability to really model gully erosion remains, in fact, limited, but not just limited, very, very limited. This is especially so at such large scales for large regions or continents. And what makes this hard is, in fact, that you'll need to obtain a trade-off between, let's say, an accurate process description, as well as keeping the data requirements for a detailed model as low as possible. So you can make a highly complex model, but not apply it at such a large scale, or you can aim for a very simple model that can be applied at the continental scale, but does not fully capture what is going on with these gullies. And this is a point I hope to illustrate throughout this talk. But because we can model gully erosion very badly, we also know quite little about its actual contribution to catchment sediment export rates and to further assess the impacts that gully erosion may have in that regard. And such tools to assess impacts and avoid negative consequences are badly needed. This is already clear when we look, for example, to other erosion studies. This is a study by Borelli showing the change in sheet and rill erosion rates, so overland erosion rates over the past decades because of land use changes. What you see is, especially in the global south, so in South America and sub-Saharan Africa mainly, erosion rates have already drastically increased. And this will likely continue so in the future. This is, for example, the population projections per continent for this century. As you can see, Africa is expected to see an increase of over 3 billion people over the coming decades. So this really emphasizes the need for good tools that can assess the impacts, for example, of land use changes on erosion rates. What we are working on with our team is basically to develop tools and models that allow us to predict gully erosion at regional and continental scales, but also assess the role of gully erosion for catchment sediment yields and other impacts at such scale. Mainly apply rather empirical approaches that build, however, on existing modeling concepts we obtained over the past decades, and a lot of our research focuses on Africa. So while building this model, we have in fact several working hypotheses that are that may or may not be correct, but that help us basically constrain and frame the problem so that it becomes feasible. So a first limitation of our work, and most of this talk, is that we mainly focus on permanent gullies. There are also ephemeral gullies, smaller gullies that are tilled away by farmers, but as they are very difficult to map at such scales, I do not want to claim that our results are really representative for this erosion form. Also, our model mainly focuses on modeling long-term average gully erosion rates. So not on an event basis, but rather like the revised universal soil loss equation for sheet and rill erosion. We hope to start saying something about what is on average the rate of gully erosion. And the basic structure or idea behind our model we try to develop is that gully erosion can in fact be subdivided in two key factors that can be modeled separately. First of all, there's the gully density, and second, there's the gully expansion rate per gully. And for this gully expansion rate, we mainly assume for the moment that gully headcut retreat is the most important process. Several studies tend to confirm this, but this is also our starting point. So what is our main modeling strategy? Basically to first develop a model for gully expansion or gully headcut retreat, and then also focus on gully density, develop a second model for that, and then we can couple both to obtain the gully erosion rate. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is share my insights in this on what we know now about the controlling factors of gully headcut retreat rates at global scales. So the expansion rates. Also present some recent advancements in predicting gully densities and initiation. To then move on to some ongoing work and scope for further research, mainly how can we combine these two for saying something about the total erosion rate. So let's start with saying something more about these gully headcut retreat rates. Basically, a gully head, as you see in the landscape here, is the end or the starting point of a gully, and the starting point advances upslope or upstream through time typically. And a lot of studies have quantified this process, and it is often quite significant. This is, for example, an image from Ionita in Romania. As you can see, in 1980, the gully was at the very left part of the picture. In 2005, it advanced with several hundreds of meters. A lot of studies have tried to compile and measure this process and obtained interesting local insights in what drives this process. However, the results strongly differed as they varied strongly from one region to another. Soil type, land use, all these things can play a role. So what we did in this review is basically compile all these measurements we could find worldwide and do basically a meta-analysis of these measurements to see what explains this global this process at the global scale. What are the most important controlling factors? For those interested, this is a study that was published in 2016, Earth Science Reviews, and we also included the whole data set of measurements for those wanting to have a look. So what were our key results? Basically, these gully headcut retreat rates, here they are expressed as a volumetric retreat rates in cubic meters per year. They are strongly correlated by the contributing area, and more or less the square root of this contributing area. This is quite logical and known, meaning because if you have a larger area draining towards that gully headcut, you can have more water accumulated to that head, and that water can cause more erosion. In fact, the main surprise of this result was that the relation was significant, but only so weak. It only explains around 15% of the variation, which was a bit surprising because we expected this to be higher. So we looked on and saw and explored what else can explain this global variation. And in fact, the key factor we identified was rainfall intensity. We tested several proxies for this, and what worked best was basically what is called the rainy day normal, which is a very simple proxy. It just gives you it just takes the average annual rainfall for that site divided by the average number of days on which it rains. So it expresses the amount of rainfall on a day with rain. Now what we see is that this long-term average RDN values explain about half of the observed variation in gully headcut retreat rates. And this is quite remarkable because, as you notice, the y-axis on this graph is logarithmic. So headcut retreat rates may vary from just a few kilograms per year up to over hundreds of thousands of tons per year. So really full truckloads of dirt that are removed every year because of gully erosion. And 50% of that variation is explained by rainfall intensity. If you combine it then with our other factor, contributing area, saying something about how much water can be accumulated, you explain already nearly 70% of the observed variation in headcut retreat rates. There's a second lesson to be drawn for this, and that is the sensitivity to potential climate change. As you see in this relation, the RDN, the rainfall intensity, is in the formula with an exponent of nearly 5. So this means that a slight change in rainfall intensity can have enormous consequences on headcut retreat rates. And such changes are exactly also what are predicted. So basically, this is a study showing expected changes in daily rainfall intensity or rainy day normal. This is expected to increase worldwide with about 10 to 15%. This implies 10 to 15% to the power 5 would imply that if all other factors remain the same, gully erosion rates may easily double or triple over the next century. Strangely enough, these were the only factors that we could clearly identify at such global scales. To some extent, this might be because of the fact that often we do not have all the details of the measurements. It's a meta-analysis, so the data quality may also vary a bit. But it's at least surprising to see, for example, that a factor like land use or land cover have only very, very slight and even not statistically significant effects. The second reason might be for this that in fact the ranges in land use conditions are quite narrow. All these studies are, for example, conducted in erosion-prone landscape with active headcuts. That's why scientists went into the field and measured them. So that might be an important factor. But we expect that once a gully is triggered, the actual land use might also be less important, and the process is really driven by runoff, which is controlled by contributing area and the amount of rainfall. Nonetheless, land use, as we know from previous work, is likely very important in explaining why you have gullies or not. And then we move to the second part, saying something about gully densities. And if we want to say something about gully densities and model this process, we of course need to say something first about what we already know about the controlling factors of gully initiation. So if you can initiate more gullies, you will form more gullies, and the gullies will of course, the gully density will of course increase. And we know from previous work, of course, that gullies mainly form when the power of runoff water is large enough to start incising into the soil. That's the same with river erosion. But if this process continues, this will become deeper and deeper, and you will form a headcut that starts to retreat upslope. And what researchers have focused on so far is something that is called the slope area threshold. What does this slope area threshold imply? Basically, it's a more simple and empirical reflection of the fact that in order to incise into the soil, you need to pass a certain resistance. And this is expressed between a critical velocity or shear stress that needs to be exceeded and depends on soil characteristics. The actual shear stress or velocity caused by water that runs off is determined by several factors, but they mainly depend on the hydraulic radius or the discharge and the slope angle. And we know that slope area, or we know that, as I said before, a good proxy for the runoff discharge or the hydraulic radius is often this contributing area, the area upstream of a gully head, while also the slope is something we can easily measure from, for example, a digital elevation model. So what does the slope area threshold concept then implies? It shows basically where a gully might form or not based on just a digital elevation model. And these are some illustrations of this. So every cross here is the exact position of a gully head, and more specifically, what is the area draining towards that position in the landscape, and what is the local slope. And what you see is that in all these cases, there seems to be a lower line, meaning that if you are in a combination with a slope or a contributing area that is below this threshold, you will likely not form a gully. If you are above this threshold, it is possible to have a gully at that spot. And we know from earlier work that this is already a very handy tool to predict where in an area you might form gullies. This is at a very local scale in Belgium. You see the gray zones. These are basically the topographic positions in a landscape where the slope area threshold is exceeded for this type. The dark lines are the observed gullies. So you see here that in this case, the position of the gullies is generally well predicted. But one important limitation is, of course, that these thresholds, they are empirical thresholds and they vary from region to region, from study area to study area. And what will determine their empirical constants? It's basically a lot of things. The soil characteristics, local weather conditions, but also, and probably especially, land use. And this is, for example, synthesis figure by Tori and Pouzin in a review paper, where they compile these different slope area thresholds. And what they notice is that indeed, for forest and grasslands, these thresholds are a lot higher than, for example, for cropland, which is logical because cropland offers less soil protection, but it's also more likely to generate more runoff than a forest or grassland. So this implies that the slope area concept might be something interesting on the long term to also use to predict gully erosion at regional and continental scales, but many difficulties basically remain. Basically, we need to find ways to incorporate also the role of other controlling factors like climate and weather conditions, the spatial patterns of the land use and soil characteristics, potentially effects of temporal land use dynamics, etc. And it's especially there that we quickly encounter the limits of the input data we have at such scales. Not only that, also not all these controls are quite well understood at the moment. So once again, as I said in the beginning of the talk, there's a kind of trade-off between being sufficiently accurate in a physical way and describing the process in detail, and limiting the input errors because your input data is subject to uncertainties of limited resolution and you cannot account for all factors. For example, we might know that the organic material in the soil is an important factor in some cases to form a gully or not. But if you don't really have data on that, you cannot really use it to predict gully erosion at such large scale. So what we are interested in is finding this sweet spot or this minimum in the total model error. And this total error depends on the one hand, the model error, how accurately is your process described, and the input error, how well adapted is your input data to actually simulate this process. So where are we at the moment then with regard to modeling gully density? We have moved, I think, quite far over the past years. And the first question we need to ask is, how do we actually quantify a gully density? What is typically used is total gully length, for example, in kilometer per square kilometer, but also often an areal fraction covered by gullies. This says a bit more because it accounts also for the width of the gully, and it allows for faster data collection, which is important at large scales because you can approximate the area gully density just by selecting, for example, a number of random points and then checking which fraction falls inside a gully or not. And this fraction gives a good approximation of the areal gully density. So this is something we tried 5 or 6 years ago. In, for example, the Chinese Loess Plateau, where we quantified average gully density for a number of catchments, 46 in the Chinese Loess Plateau. And then using a simple empirical approach, a multiple regression model, we could already predict quite well the average gully density at such catchment scale. And this seemed to be mainly depending on topographic conditions as well as vegetation cover. So these results are quite robust, but using aerial gully density also comes with important limitations. For example, they are the results of both gully initiation and expansion. We know expansion head-cut retreat, but do we have a high area of gullies because we have formed many gullies, or because the gullies we formed are very nice or are very large? So this is a distinction we need to make. Secondly, we know also that gullies are formed often under very local conditions because slope and contributing area in combination with land use exceeds a certain threshold, for example. An aerial density just says something about the spatial fraction on average. So it does not really allow at the catchment scale to zoom in on why do you have a gully on that location or why not. So for this, we started developing an alternative approach where we did not measure the lengths or the area of gullies at the catchment scale, but started to look to the actual gully head density. How many gully heads do you have per square kilometer? And to do this, we started generating random sites of only 1 square kilometer and mapped all the gully heads within that test site that we could find. So this was an example for Tunisia. This is, for example, a case in Madagascar, where you see some gullies here and all the pins indicate the exact position of a gully head. This is still an ongoing study from one of my PhD students, but we are moving quite far in collecting data at the continental scale for Africa. So far we have around 1,600 sites. About 2/3 of those are spread randomly across the continent. About 1/3 is concentrated in really important hotspots. And in total, we mapped already around 44,000 heads this way. And just looking to the data already reveals some interesting patterns. For example, we see that on average, 1 site in 3 of the randomly distributed sites have at least 1 gully, while more than 5% can have more than 100 gullies. So this means that if you go any place in Africa, the chances that you find a gully somewhere within 1 square kilometer are quite significant, confirming that this is indeed a highly important process. Also, we detect already some important regional variations. As I said, important sediment yield hotspots are, for example, Northern Africa, Ethiopia, and Madagascar. As expected and confirmed by our data, these are also exactly the spots where we find a lot of gully heads. We explored this data set already a little bit just by looking to the sites with at least 1 gully head mapped and try to see what explains then these spatial differences in gully head density. We did some basic statistical analysis on this and discovered that mainly NDVI, soil characteristics like the percentage of soil and topography play an important role in explaining this variability. And with this, you can already construct a first simple regression model predicting the gully head density based on such simple factors. Such model can explain already around 57% of the observed variation, which is definitely not a bad start. Around 95% of our predictions are correct within 1 order of magnitude. If you then know that gully densities can vary over 3 or 4 order of magnitudes easily, that's not so bad at all. However, such approach, we learned, also comes with important limitations. For example, using a classical multiple regression does not really allow you to fully identify important feedbacks and interactions between relevant factors. For example, it might be that steeper slopes are more prone to gully erosion, but often they are also more stony, have less deep soils, and are more likely to be forested. So these are important interactions, and if you just look at it with one multiple regression equation at the continental scale, these are things you cannot digitally capture. Above all, we also noticed that while our data set is already quite large, we nearly did not have, or we clearly did not have enough data yet to really capture and analyze statistically all these local variations. And mapping individual gully heads on such a scale for thousands of sites is something very, very labor intensive. So that's why recently we started developing an alternative approach where we used, on the one hand, machine learning, as this is more flexible to account for potential feedbacks, but also where we used a more semi-quantitative approach to map gully head densities. That may be a bit less accurate than really mapping the exact position, but that is much, much faster. So how did we do this? Basically, we continued working with just random test sites of 1 square kilometer, and we divided each test site into a grid of 9 cells. And then we would visually expect for every of these cells, how many gully heads do we observe in that cell. So just to explain here, the example I show, there's an inset A, and you may see red dots. These are actual gully heads that you can easily detect in Google Earth. Instead of mapping all this, we would just assign a score to this. 0 means that there's no gullies in that grid cell. 1 means there's between 1 to 5. 3 means more than 21. And in this case, 2 means somewhere between 6 and 20 gullies. So this is less accurate than really counting the gullies. But we notice that overall, the uncertainty associated with such scores remains quite limited, while the approach is easily 10 times faster, which means that you can obtain a reasonable assessment saying here there are, let's say, about 40 to 50 gullies in, let's say, 1 or 2 minutes, while before mapping this would easily take 20 or 30 minutes. So this speed advantage allows you to collect more data for a much larger area in a much faster or in the same amount of time. And that's what we tried in this study for the Horn of Africa. Basically, we mapped gully densities this way for around 2,700 sites across this area. Most of these points were random, but then we also targeted, again, some zones where we know gully densities were quite high, but uncertainties on our first model were quite large as well. With this data set of 1,700 files, we then applied our 1,700 sites, we then applied a machine learning approach using random forest, combined also with an uncertainty assessment. I'm going to spare you the details, but the idea was that for each of these sites, we extract a large number of factors that may help explaining why there are gullies or not. So for example, slope steepness, the land use, soil characteristics, the rainfall, etc. And then the random forest approach would basically build decision trees to see, okay, if the slope is high and the soil is like this, then I can classify this site as having so many gullies. That is repeated many, many times. And the resulting random forest gives then an average prediction of, based on all these decision trees he builds, what is most likely to be the observed value. So this is a purely empirical approach. Basically also a large black box, but what we noticed is that it works quite well. This is, for example, all the observations we have, so the estimated gully head densities per square kilometer. This is the resulting map if you apply then this random forest to the whole study area. As you can already see visually, our model succeeds quite well in reproducing these spatial tendencies. What is more interesting, or even more interesting, is that this also seems to offer a lot of room for further improvements. And basically, one thing we noticed is that the more data you can put into this model, the better your prediction becomes. So this is shown on the left. So we use different subsets of data. Each time we validated it with an independent validation set, so the red points. But then first we tried training it only with the blue points, and then your model efficiency is basically around 0. If you just add 500 additional points or 400 additional points, your model jumps already a lot higher in terms of performance. If you then include also additional targeted points, it goes even better. And if you include both data sets, so both the random and the targeted additional points, your model improves further. So we have certainly not reached the limit of this yet. Our main point here was to illustrate that this is really a fruitful approach, but it does not fully solve a problem. For example, as I said, it is mainly a black box model, and you can get something, what is called feature importances from such a random forest approach, which tells you on average how important, how often does a variable occur in decision trees, and what role does it play in making decisions. This can generate schemes like this, but it does not say you why certain factors are important. And a lot of these importances are quite surprising and maybe even counterintuitive. I will not discuss this here in detail due to a lack of time, but basically it also does not tell you if a certain effect, like the fraction of silt in your soil, if that's a positive or negative effect. So one of the implications is that our previous work on mapping these individual gully heads is certainly not obsolete. And a random forest approach or machine learning can help us in understanding where gully erosion is going on and why. But if we really want to develop tools that can predict how will this evolve in the future and what land use management strategies are we going to need to use to avoid impacts, we will need something less black box and something more process oriented. And this is something we're also still working on. So basically the fact that we know the position of all these individual gully heads allows us also to apply, for example, a real slope area threshold concept, and then not just use the contributing area, but really estimate the volumes of runoff based, for example, on a simple runoff model. This is something we're working on, but our first results are really encouraging. So to wrap up, what can we say then about the total gully erosion rate? So as I said, this gully erosion rate can then basically seen as the product of how fast gullies expand, headcut retreat, and how many gullies there are, gully densities. We are not there yet in developing a full model that can predict this, but we can already obtain some insights using some very simple assumptions and approximation. For example, for each site we mapped, we know from previous work that the average contributing area to a gully head is around 4 hectares. And we know that if we know this contributing area, and we know the rainy day normal, which we can extract quite easily, we can estimate the gully headcut retreat rates. So if we just multiply the number of observed gully heads with the headcut retreat rate, we can get a crude order of magnitude estimate of the actual gully erosion rate at that site. And it's important to really emphasize that these numbers are likely strong overestimations, above all because not all headcuts remain active and some stabilize over time. This is something we do not account for here. But what is most strange or surprising in such simple multiplication exercise is that the observed number of gully heads says very little about the resulting hypothetical gully erosion rate that you would expect at this site. And why is that? or it might be even lower than what is indicated in this very low scatter plot, because here we do not account for the fact that if you have more gully heads at a site, their average contributing area will also decline. So this regression line would likely become even flatter. So why is this that we do not find any relation between, or not a strong relation between the number of head cuts and the number of on the total gully erosion rates at such scale? It's mainly because the head cut retreat rate, which is then mainly controlled by rainfall intensity only, is likely much more important than only or than the number of heads. This is of course only a statistical consideration. We only notice that gully head densities vary between 1 and 3, for example, while erosion rates may 1 and 1,000, sorry, head cuts per square kilometer, while erosion rates may easily vary between less than a ton and several hundreds of thousands of tons, so 7 orders of magnitudes. So what can we say then about catchment sediment yields? Knowing all this, not so much yet, but I think the results here are also very encouraging. And this is a simple experiment we did for 7 catchments in Ethiopia again, where we mapped the gully head density as well as the aerial density. And both proxies are closely related. However, if you then plot them against the observed sediment yield, you indeed see that these gully head densities have an even, that both correlate well with sediment yield, but that especially these gully head densities tend to explain a large fraction of the observed variation. These may seem to contradict what I just said, that it's not their gully, the number of gully heads, but their retreat rates. But in fact, this is not the case, because we are all looking to catchments here that are very similar in rainfall intensity properties. So they likely have quite similar head cut retreat rates. And in that case, of course, it's mainly the number of gullies that you have in a catchment that will determine the erosion rate. And as this strong correlation suggests, this will have a very strong influence on catchment sediment yields, likely because these gullies are indeed a very significant sediment source. So just to wrap up, gully erosion modeling at continental scale is clearly becoming more and more feasible. If you look to the gully head cut retreat rate problems, this seems to be something that is mainly driven by climate and then especially rainfall intensity. We can quantify this, and this already helps us a lot, but it also shows that gullies are highly sensitive to climate change probably. When it comes to gully densities, this is also becoming quite predictable at such large scales with acceptable accuracies. And then here, especially land use and vegetation cover, as well as topography and soil characteristics seem to play an important role. The gully expansion rates likely have a far greater influence, however, on the total gully erosion rates than the observed gully densities at a given moment. But if we manage to couple both types of models, it should become feasible to also predict gully erosion rates on average on the longer timescales. And this opens interesting perspectives to also predict catchment sediment yields. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Matthias, for such an impressive talk. I learned a lot of new as a work quality professional, not related very close to geomorphic processes and erosion, so thank you very much. And we have a number of questions. And first question is from Kate Crusting, student, undergrad student of Moscow State Hydrology Department. And she'd like to know, what is the role of human impact on the gully erosion?
Well, the role can be quite large, but then it's mainly via land use changes. So if we, for example, start deforesting certain slopes, and start to cultivate that land, what happens mostly is that your runoff will proceed or will increase, and you will be more likely to exceed what we call this critical threshold in shear stress, and a gully may form. So that is the most classical example. And this is something that is still going on quite fast, for example, in the global south. But there are, as I showed you some pictures, much more extreme situations, like, for example, in tropical cities. This is also a form of land use change that can generate a lot of runoff and can also cause large gullies. A second indirect role is, of course, via climate change, which is also something that strongly influences gully erosion.
Sure. Thank you very much. The next question is from Murad from Algeria. And the question is, what is the role of rainfall erosivity, erosion, in terms of sediment yields?
So, as I just showed in the presentation, we see that gully heads retreat rates are often strongly influenced by rainfall intensity. And we know the same for example, sheet and rill erosion on the surface. However, if you just look to catchment sediment yields, we know that it should play a role, but you have had a lot of studies before in the past that show that this is very complex. And if you would plot, for example, rainfall versus sediment yield, often you find no clear relation. And why is that? Because you have a lot of other controlling factors, including topography, the soil type, but also important feedbacks, and then mainly with vegetation cover. If you have more rain, it can also mean that you have better vegetation cover and less proneness to erosion. So there's quite a bit of literature, and it really depends on the situation. But the most famous example, I think, is the studies of Langba and Schum, I think in the 50s. So you can surely look into that.
Okay, that's great, thank you. The next question is from undergrad students, Moscow State University Hydrology Department, Artem Gorbarenko. And the question is, what is the reason for choosing random forest analysis? What's the advantages of this model over the other machine learning approaches?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
We chose random forests because they are still conceptually understandable and they are not too calculation intensive, which remains an important issue at such large scales. But you also have supported vector machine and a lot of other approaches, and quite a bit of studies have already tested them as well at case study levels. There's quite a bit of studies in Iran that compared different approaches of machine learning to predict gully erosion. We looked into the literature, and what we found from that, or concluded from that, is that random forests are basically among the better techniques to do that. At least based on these case studies. And given that it is also something feasible and understandable, that's why we tested it in this study.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, agree with you about that. And the next question is from Neja, sorry if I pronounce it wrong, Majad, doctor on geochemistry and environment. And the question is the impact of gully development on hydrology sediment yield and landscape evolution can change according to climate and land use conditions? Yes,
definitely. So indeed, if land use changes, this can have a huge impact on the formation of gullies, and again, the hydrological impacts, the impacts on sediment loads, etc. But this works both ways. There are many areas that are very arid, where you have already a lot of gullies, and they can continue to influence the hydrology and the connectivity. But because these areas became arid, it's often likely that the gullies are much older and were formed under wetter conditions. But then the area became more arid, less rainfall, and the gullies just remain in the landscape. Although they do not further expand, they are somehow fossilized in the landscape. And that is, of course, an important distinction. It's not because you have a lot of gullies that you have a lot of gully erosion, but the gullies that are there can continue to have an impact.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question from myself, or from me, why did you choose African continent for such a large continental analysis of gully erosion, but not an Asian continent, for example? I mean, Asian continent is the most populated continent.
Yeah, good question. Because we believe that the research needs are in fact mainly lying in Africa, and a lot of, or so far, not a lot of studies have focused on this continent, while a lot more work has concentrated, for example, on the Chinese Loess Plateau. And I'm looking again for the graph, but if you just look to the projections, I'll share my screen again quickly. If you just look to the projections, at the moment, there are around 1.2 billion Africans.
Right.
In 2100, it's projected that this will be 4.2. And of course, this will have huge impacts on the land use and as a result on the erosion rates. And that's what this map already shows for sheet and rill erosion. Erosion rates are mainly increasing over the past decades in these areas. But we cannot fully predict this yet. So this basically explains why we want to concentrate on this continent. This in combination with the fact that it's also a continent that has a very large climatic variability and variability in other environmental settings, making it very interesting to study erosion processes at a large scale.
Yeah, thank you, absolutely. It's great. Thank you again, Matthias, for such a great talk. And it was a pleasure to have you here as one of our lecturers.
The pleasure was mine.